Now we're moving into part 2 of chapter 6, video notes. And where we left off, we were talking about the 4 different ways that humans can affect biodiversity. The first one was the habitat alteration, and as a component of that was the habitat fragmentation. We also have the demand for wildlife products, and now we're picking up with the third one, which is adding toxic substances to the food chain, food web, biome, that type of thing. And that is in the form of pollution. Human pollution is one of the largest impacts we have on the environment. So put a star back on it. This is kind of the biggest piece of it. So we're going to talk about a couple of different things involved with pollution. And pollution is really, when we talk about toxic things, it's not necessarily like the radioactive or extreme acids or bases or that type of thing. It's just basically anything that can be harmful to other organisms. The bell ringer that you have on Monday, where we looked at the footprints and looked at kind of the trash that we leave behind. You're supposed to cut the plastic things that hold pop cans together because of what they can do to wildlife and how they get stuck on them. There was this huge whale that washed up on the shore, and the amount of trash and garbage that was in it contributed to its death. So when you talk about pollution, it's not just necessarily these extremely toxic things. It's things that aren't natural to the habitat that can influence a species or an organism. Another reason that makes pollution such a big factor in biodiversity is biological magnification. This is the process in which concentrations of harmful substances increase in organisms at higher trophic levels. So remember back to our little pyramid here, we had the different trophic levels. And what happens is something that possibly get into our primary producers at maybe a lower level. As we go up the pyramid, it's going to increase in toxicity and amount. And that can start to wreak havoc on some of these higher level trophic organisms. So one example that kind of where this biological magnification played a role is this DDT. So what happened was, it was this pesticide that was used. It was widely used. It is a great pesticide because it was cheap, was active for a long time, and killed kind of a lot of different insects, and was kind of help curb some of the disease-carrying mosquitoes. This was sprayed across wide areas, again entering those kind of primary producers. But what happened was, as this became more concentrated, as it moved up the food chain, we began to see issues with some of these higher trophic level organisms, and one was some of the birds. So some of the bigger birds had some issues because birds that maybe ate fish, like the bald eagle, the osprey, pelican, they started having problems with their shells. So when they were laying eggs, their shells were so fragile that they couldn't remain intact. So you have this decrease in the population because their birth rate is lower. If you don't have eggs that can withstand kind of the normal environment, they're not going to be able to kind of sustain the population. And so they started noticing that these birds that specifically ate the fish were having some issues. And it kind of linked back to, they were spraying this DDT, which was getting into the lakes and the rivers, getting into those primary producers. Once they get into the lakes and the rivers, they get into the fish with what they're eating, and then as we go up, it becomes more and more dangerous. So you can only imagine the amount of kind of pesticides or different chemicals or things that we are putting into the environment that it might come back to eventually cause us some problems because of this biological magnification. So while at the lower level it seems to be all right, as we increase in the trophic levels and the amount of contact that basically the organism has with that, there's going to be some side effects from that. The other piece of that was mercury. So one of the things that we have to be concerned with being in Minnesota is this mercury content and the biomagnification from it. Again, mercury is highly toxic. That's why it's, you no longer have those mercury thermometers, things like that, because there are going to be a lot of toxic side effects from it that are going to risk anyone who's exposed to it. That's why they say not to eat contaminated fish, and pregnant women especially are not supposed to be eating that type of stuff because it can cause a wide range of problems. It can cause birth defects, issues with neurodevelopment. There's lots of different things that can be an issue if there's too much mercury ingested. So for us as humans in our population, something that many Minnesotans like to do with fishing can be a problem for us. So here is just kind of a graphic that walks us through the biological magnification of mercury. So we look at, it is kind of in small amounts, and the algae kind of play a role in this. So the algae absorbs some of it, goes into some of our lower level consumers, and then it gets passed on to the fish and to these guys and also us as well. So we look at the different things that kind of happen, and while the content in some of these don't necessarily contribute to mass extinction or that type of thing, there are going to be some problems, but as the concentration gets higher, it's going to wreak a lot more havoc on us than maybe on some of the lower levels. So just some things to think about when we look at humans and their role that they play in the environment. The fourth and kind of final piece of our role in how we influence biodiversity, so we put a number 4, is introduced species. Humans transport organisms throughout the world, both intentionally and unintentionally. This leads to what we call invasive species. These are organisms that thrive in new habitats and outcompete native plants and animals. So these species are what we consider generalists. They easily survive in habitats. They reproduce rapidly, and often lack predators to control their population. So there are kind of three pieces to the success of invasive species. And they can survive, they can reproduce rapidly, and often don't have those predators that are going to control their population. And that is because either intentionally or unintentionally, we have brought them into a habitat that they can kind of go out of control. And we think back to Australia's situation with the rabbits. That would be considered an invasive species. We brought something that was not currently in the area and had all three of these components, and it's wreaking havoc on the rest of the ecosystem. So when we think again back to how this affects maybe us in the area, we have some invasive species as well. The zebra mussels, there's this big thing about cleaning your boats and making sure that you're not transporting these zebra mussels. And look what can happen with this invasive species that can reproduce rapidly, handle the environment, and doesn't have a lot of natural predators. Also the Asian carp, if we look at our Asian carp buddies down here, again, when we think back to factors that are going to limit population growth, the introduction of a new species that can rapidly reproduce and compete for the same resources, we're going to have some problems with the current species that are already in there. So by humans introducing these species, we have contributed to the loss of biodiversity because other species that were thriving are no longer going to thrive. Alright, a couple more that we're going to talk about is the Eurasian milfoil. And this is this aquatic plant here. It was commonly used as an aquarium plant and then got introduced to the ecosystem and creates a couple of problems. The first is, again, we think back to the three components of an invasive species being able to reproduce rapidly and survive the environment and not really have any common predators. We think back to the exponential growth. Those are all pieces that are going to cause this exponential growth of invasive species. And this milfoil falls into that. And it's problematic because it creates these really dense mats and it doesn't allow the normal kind of oxygen transfer between the wind and the water, that type of thing. And they can also trap sediment in there, and the human component as well. They block us from enjoying some of the natural beauty of the lake and swimming, fishing, water skiing, boating, that type of thing. So because we have introduced it to the population, to the ecosystem, it's inhibiting ourselves, but also the biodiversity because we're robbing oxygen, creating kind of a big mess. Another one is this nutria, where they kind of look like beavers / muskrats. They're actually a rodent, what we call a rodent, and they're about 10 pounds, and they really ravage the wetlands. They're kind of like the rabbits in the sense that they can produce a lot. So they can have between 5 and 13 in their litter, and they can breed again 2 days after giving birth. So they can have up to 3 times a year. So we have that component of being able to reproduce quite rapidly. And the problem is they actually kind of eat the producers within the wetland, and what that does is it kind of actually degrades the wetland because they eat these marsh roots that keep the wetlands intact. So they're really devastating this wetland environment ecosystem, and that's why we consider them an invasive species.